All right, what is going on, guys? Welcome back to another banger react video. It's been way too goddamn long since I reacted to some content, and today we're going to be reacting to why the 2000 looked that way. I'm a bit older, so this video is probably going to hit pretty hard. I grew up in the early 2000s. I started my teenage years around the early 2000s, and it was an absolute treat to get to experience. But yeah, let's get into it, guys. I'm really excited to watch this.
When the New Year's ball dropped on January 1st, 2000, there was an
I remember
overwhelming
it.
feeling of change. Whether it was people prepping their bunkers for a potential apocalyptic event,
Y2K,
or those who were just excited about the future, they certainly had this expectation that things were just going to be different. Maybe just not in the way that they ended up being. This feeling of finally achieving world peace and reaching the end of history was soon interrupted by great turmoil and geopolitical conflict that seemed to set back this tranquility and sense of freedom that many took for granted back in the 90s. The 2000s had arrived, and these circumstances helped create the distinct traits, trends, and vibe that we typically associate with that decade now. Why did the 2000s
it was a great decade,
look
man.
that way? And was this the look that people expected to manifest when the decade first started? I want to preface this by saying that I will mostly be talking about the 2000s as it appeared in the Western world, and I will also be talking about the most prominent trends that stand out. I am talking about a 10-year period here, so I may accidentally leave a few things out, but I will do my best to cover as much as I can remember. Now, the power of nostalgia and being retrospective
I'll try and point out shit that I remember on the way,
more
too.
visibly see the things which stand out about these decades, and this only gets more noticeable over time. But sometimes it can allow us to observe the opposite as well. I feel that, in many respects, the 2000s is one of those decades that actually does not have that much distinction to it, at least compared to now. Now, I want to be clear that there are certainly things about the 2000s that are very dated now, and this observation I am making is not
It's crazy that it feels
dated.
dated.
I think it arguably does apply more to this decade than the
It
ones
feels like it
prior,
was like
and
just
there are
yesterday
several
for me.
reasons for this. Just like with any time in history, these identifiable traits were the results of unique cultural, political, and technological circumstances, and in the 2000s, many of these things held new developments back. Much like how a lot of the 70s seemed like just a culturally watered-down version of 1960s counterculture, much of the 2000s was just a watered-down version of the 90s. This is no surprise, given that a lot of people in the 70s were
why you gotta
distracted
do
with
that to me,
high
bro?
political tension and economic problems, which would have hindered some of this
That's
cultural
crazy
development.
to say that.
The 2000s saw the same thing with the war on terrorism, and this new concept that the right to liberty was now at stake. But first, I want to talk about the things that are very distinct about this period, and that requires going to the very start of this decade. In my decadology video about the 90s, I do talk about how different the start and end of that decade was. By the late 90s,
I also got
much
to
of the world
experience
had
that
fully entered
as
the
a child,
Y2K
and it was
era of futuristic,
immaculate.
chrome, reflective aesthetics that focused on the future, which showed a big contrast to the baggy denim MTV grunge era of the early 90s. This was of course due to the mass adoption of the internet and rapid advancement of computer technology, which allowed for excited people to express their vision of the future in a whole new, seemingly boundless way. Although Y2K typically has a negative connotation, given that it refers to the computer bug that was rumored to end the world, which did indeed scare a lot of people at that time, you could say that this was still an overall optimistic era. It had a primary focus on looking forward. But then, of course,
I was doing in that
at the very
exact
start
moment,
of the
man.
new millennium, you have the September 11th attacks. And these sentiments completely change. Looking back at the political climate of the 90s, there was a lot of geopolitical conflict brewing. So, while a devastating event of this magnitude wasn't something entirely unexpected, it still changed everything. It was the moment the political pendulum swung to the other side, setting the tone for the next decade. Now, in my video on the 90s, I talked about the 90s as being an overall progressive time, but I want to be clear that I am referring to it as progressive relative to the 80s. Much of the cultural status quo was an almost subconscious counter-response to Reagan conservatism. It was one of the many things that allowed for stuff like grunge to be popular. When discussing social issues, of course, this becomes much more nuanced. Things like same-sex marriage were much more accepted in 2005 than they were in 1995. I'm mostly talking about the overall tone of these periods. The 90s was a time which emphasized individuality and a pursuit of happiness, which was quite different in the 2000s. This feeling of perpetual calmness, sense of liberty, and self-governance had now been switched to be more conservative and also much more authoritarian as war efforts fully took hold. And this change in mood did express itself through art and pop culture, which was only amplified by the continued growth of the internet. I think this is one of the big reasons
The internet
for
was
why
a glorious
emo
place in the early
became
2000s,
so big
man.
at the time. Because the real world now felt much more
MySpace
rigid
days,
and controlled. The internet was an
beginning of
escape for
Facebook,
those who wanted to express themselves without
4chan.
resistance. They could now find their own community out there that accepted them. This tonal shift allowed for men to show more emotion and be more vulnerable in media without as much judgment. And so you get websites like MySpace and scene culture is born.
Yeah,
Given that
I
the
was a
very
part of that
nature of
culture.
MySpace was to have essentially unlimited customizability, it makes sense why MySpace
could put like a song on your
specifically
profile
developed
and
such
shit.
an emo community. Many of the stylistic choices of the emo aesthetic were repurposed from the hardcore punk style of the 80s and 90s. This would be called
Nu metal.
This isn't to say that emo is inherently political, because it generally isn't, but it can be. My Chemical Romance formed because of 9/11. Green Day's American Idiot is quite literally an anti-war concept album. Now I know Billy Joe Armstrong's famous response to this observation is, it's not emo, it's f***ing punk. But I do believe American Idiot is more emo than he may want to admit. It's no surprise that it quite literally shares its roots with punk rock, which is what Green Day
It was dog
is.
water.
As my friend JJ puts it, if the lead singer has eyeshadow, it's emo.
Honestly, Green Day
I'm gonna
just
piss so many people off with this video.
turned
With all these things considered, I think
sideways.
this is what ultimately gave post-punk revival and rock music altogether that very distinct look in the 2000s.
It's
what
awful.
I call the Killers look.
Green Day went
You
so
could argue that
cringe.
it was something that trickled down into general pop culture. Goth culture saw some relevancy at this time as well. Although it stems from punk and visually can look very similar, it actually shares very little in common with emo. As we discussed, emo focuses on emotion, it's in the name, whereas goth mostly focuses on the morbid and macabre, which would make sense given that this was an era where people were now very desensitized to shocking things. But despite all this great political turbulence, this Y2K futurism style that we talked about did persist and was arguably one of the few optimistic things they held onto. Because one thing in this new flipped world was in fact getting better: technology. The iMac in 1998 really was the big turning point for this. It showed that computers no longer had to only be these ugly big beige boxes. Unexpected alliteration. Computers could actually be fun and could even look like the things that they were digitally
Honestly,
rendering.
back in the day, I
With
thought those
iPod,
things were
you can
so
now hold
god-awful.
1,000 songs in your pocket, as the ad campaign highlighted. And it was this smooth, pretty, shiny white rectangle. Very sci-fi looking. Same with the iMacs, which flaunted similar designs and even many celestial graphics.
I was never an
emphasizing
iMac
that
guy.
the possibilities with these computers
I was always
were
Windows, straight
endless.
Windows.
It was basically a version of the 90s retrofuturism that evolved into something people now call Frutiger Aero. I've already done an entire video on that subject and why it was such a big trend in the 2000s, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it in this video. But in short, the rapid advancement of computer graphics and this growing ambition to create an idealized, better future than the one people were currently living in allowed for it to exist. It was also seen as a way to basically condition people to get comfortable with technology by making designs that resemble real-life objects, giving them reflective textures and gradients, therefore making them feel more familiar and therefore less technologically intimidating. Back to the whole MySpace emo discussion, there were plenty of cases where these retrospective styles intertwined. Much of the piracy world at this time exhibits these design choices. This makes sense because pirating content is an inherently rebellious thing to do. A lot of the torrenting websites and even anti-piracy ads embrace this darker kind of style. Now, I'm not saying that the "you wouldn't download a car" ad is emo or goth. That's not what I'm saying. I'm rather pointing out that these styles, although different and serve different kinds of people, do share a common ancestor. It is using these dark color palettes to represent rebellion and cynicism. I like to call it the Hot Topic look, the Tim Burton look. And it emerged at the time and place that it did for all the reasons we just discussed. It even subconsciously shows up a lot in film at this time. Have you ever noticed that a lot of movies from the early 2000s have this bluish-greenish tint to them? These films include Requiem for a Dream, 28 Days Later, The Ring, Saw, and The Grudge. But it's not just horror movies either. Sideways, Aaron Brockovich, heck, even comedies like Zoolander and Envy. A big part of it was the rise of digital color correction, known more as the digital intermediate. It was now much easier to change the overall color of your movie without having to switch out film stock and all that. So filmmakers just kind of went nuts with it. Blue just so happens to have a much more calming cinematic look to it, and the massive success of The Matrix certainly helped. While it was seen everywhere, it was mostly associated with horror or drama movies, because it does add a gloomy, suspenseful look to them. All of this just further reinforced the presence of these darker colors used in design and media throughout this decade. You may notice that even a lot of comedies at this time were quite cruel and nihilistic as well. A lot of it stems from this fatigue, apathy, and emotional detachment from the world's problems. Malcolm in the Middle is a great example of this. It is an absolutely hysterical show.
It was a good show. Also I'd give it that.
Mean. Hilariously mean. It is basically the exact opposite of the typical feel-good, Leave It to Beaver kind of show. There are no family values, no happy endings, the family's dysfunctional, none of the characters are likable, everyone is just a horrible person, and it is just perfect.
Listen to you. Something wonderful happens, and all you can think about is how the world's gonna take it away. You're growing up.
It is frankly exactly what people in the 2000s needed to see. Because at this point, people were already much more desensitized to reality and could much better see through that.
We were
Hollywood
heavily
facade.
desensitized, man.
In fact, a lot of the shows at this time followed this format. Not even just comedies. Mad Men is a very interesting case. Because although it is a period show about the 1960s, it is not nostalgic like most period shows are. It is very cynical and negative, and is a character study of just the most awful people. It is apparent that the political climate of the time created a demand for more candidness, even if it was, at times, cheeky. The Malcolm in the Middle episode where Reese joins the army literally aired during the 2004 US presidential election. It is just the quintessential show of this period, which weirdly enough brings me to 2000s fashion. The outfits that are seen on Malcolm in the Middle are so uninspired, which ironically makes them so salient. I think this sums up 2000s fashion perfectly. It looks like people trying to not try hard. You get that baggy look of the grunge 90s mixed with the Y2K colors and styles of the late 90s. So instead of oversized blue jeans, you might see baggy black pants. Instead of a neon jacket and shirt, maybe it was a regular t-shirt with some abstract designs and a dark jacket. Suddenly, you could really embrace this vibe of the time, and it was pretty inexpensive to do it. The bar on fashion was just lowered. And since the 2000s was kind of the first
I was one of those,
modern
like,
decade to really start doing that,
one of those like scene kid, like,
and a big reason for why many of these outfits
teenagers,
still don't look all that
spiky
different
hair,
from
like
what people
eyeliner,
wear today.
nail
But there are still
polish,
fashion trends that do in
baggy
fact look
pants.
dated. People wore jerseys because hip-hop and rap culture was at its peak, only getting more popular since the 90s. These styles were only further represented in media, such as MTV and TRL. Frosted Tips, as ridiculous as they look now, do kind of
never had
embody
Frosted
that
Tips, though.
chrome-like futuristic look, as it contains many of the bright colors and geometric shapes often associated with that aesthetic. As the world reached the middle of the 2000s, you then start to see fashion trends that emerge from nostalgia. Much like how the 90s repurposed much of the 60s fashion, the 2000s did this with the 70s. It all goes back to the 30-year rule that I talked about in my 90s video. Nostalgia for the 70s was big in the 2000s, with that 70s show being
I used to
a great
watch that
example
70s
for
show all
I like
the
to call
time.
this the Drake Bell look. You have that almost seen Partridge Family bull haircut, that boy band look. You see it with Zac Efron, the Jonas Brothers, Harry Potter, and even that YouTuber, Fred. That is a brand new sentence. But you can see how all these trends carried on to create the specific parts of the 2000s look that we recognize today. Which brings me back to what I mentioned at the beginning of this video. Why is it that the 2000s don't really seem all that different from today, compared to how different the 60s and 70s looked to the 2000s? This is something that a lot of people have noticed. Now, I already talked about this phenomenon in my 90s video, but there were a few things that I left out that I wanted to talk about here. In short, the globalization of the internet was a big part of it. Fashion was no longer dictated by centralized mass media. It was now in the hands of people like you and me. Compound this with the fact that the late 90s and 2000s look is not that sophisticated, like we just talked about.
It's because, like,
you could spend a couple bucks on some clothes at the thrift store, and
it's because fashion was like, it was like centralized to like pockets of the planet, like, and everybody kind of like wore something different. And then as soon as everybody was interconnected with each other, it just completely just flipped the script and changed everything.
and immediately look like you're from the 2000s. Therefore, it's now much more convenient to dress that way. You could theoretically do this with inexpensive thrift clothes from the 60s and 70s as well, but those outfits are less common nowadays because it was so long ago. Because the 2000s were more recent, the trends are a little bit fresher, and these circumstances have prolonged their relevance prior to other decades. But also, have they? It is not exactly unheard of for people living in their respective decades to think that the previous decade is still pretty similar. I remember being alive in the early 2000s thinking that the early 90s still looked pretty modern. But for one, early 90s media was still pretty common on TV, therefore I had exposure to it in everyday life. And also I received a lot of hand-me-down clothes from that time. So that's really just recency bias. In my 90s video, I made the point that period pieces that take place in the 2000s don't really have to put that much effort into making things look 2000s. The Dropout is a good example of this. You could totally see people dressing like this today, and it wouldn't look weird. Whereas if you saw someone dressed like the Monkees, it would absolutely stand out. But you could also make a case for the opposite. Freaks and Geeks was made in 1999, but the show takes place in 1980. But the thing is, it doesn't really put that much effort into looking 80s either. In fact, someone I watched the show with, who is knowledgeable of history, thought the show just took place in the time it was made. Donnie Darko is another example. Was made in 2001, but takes place in 1988. Yet it doesn't look that 80s. This has more or less always been the case. It's just that the internet and fast fashion has prolonged it with the 2000s and made it more contemporarily pronounced. Despite these things making the 2000s seem less distinct, there are certainly areas where you can divide the decade into two separate points, much like with the 90s. This is especially easy when you incorporate the omnipresence of the internet. You could say that the creation of sites like Facebook, MySpace, and YouTube ended the dot-com era of the 2000s and started the iPhone, Twitter era of the 2000s. And the creation of the iPhone, of course, helped jumpstart the social media app store culture of the 2010s. By the late 2000s, there was a growing sense of fatigue for this government surveillance and authoritarianism, and people wanted change, particularly progressive change. This was only amplified with the 2008 recession, and it was clear at this point that things were about to go in a different direction and exhibit a tone that was very different from the start of the decade. I've seen the 2000s be overall described as a very mean-spirited decade, one full of dark humor,
Yeah, the
pessimism,
humor
and
was
indifference. But
kids
once again,
nowadays would
you can
not
also
survive
find
in the early
opposite examples
2000s.
to this. There are plenty of songs from this period that are also very poppy and positive. Same with many Nickelodeon shows. Even the show Pushing Daisies is almost distractingly positive and goofy. But it also does have a bit of that Frutiger Arrow kind of design, if you ask me. So although these are exceptions, they do prove the rule, because they often borrow from these trends and repurpose them to communicate whatever it is that they want to communicate in a mainstream way. I guess the main takeaway here is that if something looks, sounds, and behaves a certain way, even if it's in the most boring way, there is always a reason why. Everything
It's true.
has an entire story to tell. If you would like to see... Have they not heard of a cell phone? Jan, there's a George Glass here to see you. If you would like to see more of my videos on decades, I have included a playlist right here. It will grow more with time. You can also find my Frutiger Arrow video in the top right corner if you'd like to watch that as well. A special thanks to all my Patreon supporters, patreon.com/nationsquid. Buying me a coffee is also always appreciated as well. Thank you for watching, everyone.
All right, guys, that was an interesting video. Brought me back a little bit, back to one of the most important times of my life. Like I said, thank you guys for watching. Make sure you guys are following me on all socials. I go live on TikTok, Twitch, and I'm constantly posting on TikTok. So make sure you follow me over there at Fykis519 on both platforms. And yeah, thank you guys for hanging out. I will be back for another video real soon. Looking to post more long form content, so look out for more react videos. We're going to be doing a lot of other stuff on this channel, so stay tuned. And make sure you hit the like button down below. Hit subscribe if you want to join along. And yeah, because we're trying to get to 1,000 followers. Close to 1,000 followers before the end of the year. I don't know. We'll see how the grind pans out. But yeah, like I said, thank you. And we'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.